Good morning, everyone. I am speaking to you because Professora Daniela asked me to speak with you about Oppenheimer, which you are going to be watching, I guess, in a short while. It's extremely early morning, so excuse my tired face, but I wanted to make sure that I have a chance to share some ideas with you as you go into watching this film. Um, Professor Daniela asked me to speak to you about trauma, and I think the only way to understand trauma, and specifically from a post colonial feminist lens when watching Oppenheimer, is to understand how Oppenheimer, the film, is one in a long line of Hollywood cinema that essentially engages in a few practices that have become historically the norm in the global north. And in that sense, for me personally, Oppenheimer does nothing more than propagate historical exclusion and trauma for specific communities, specifically non white communities and women. And so the concepts I want to talk to you very quickly about are that of whitewashing, erasure, both the erasure of um, women and non white individuals and histories. And finally, the idea of white centering and the white gaze and what this does for our understanding of history and what that means for the propagation and perpetuation of harm and trauma for specific individuals and communities that has been essentially underscored by the film Oppenheimer, which again is, not, like I said, not a surprise considering the fact that it is coming in a long line of films. So, just to give you an idea, whitewashing is an expression, a concept that means to alter in a way which favors, features, or caters to white people. So, for example, casting a person who is a white performer in a role that is based on a non white person or a fictional character. And we see this very, very clearly in various Hollywood cinema productions. So, for example, we're talking about Oppenheimer. I'm going to get to this. The fact that Oppenheimer doesn't even start speaking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we have another example. So we have Clint Eastwood's Iwo Jima, which is approximately 3 hours long without the appearance of a single Japanese person. Or you have Scarlett Johansson's Ghost in the Shell, again, a reference to Japan and Japanese anime. And there's a white woman essentially playing the role of a Japanese cyborg, robotic individual. So we are basically seeing in that when Christopher Nolan is facing critique and criticism for his selection of an all-white cast, it is not that he is being criticized on the basis of his selection for Oppenheimer alone. He's criticized on not only his own history, but a long history of Hollywood, essentially erasing and whitewashing history, removing the presence of non-white individuals from the spaces that they had occupied. And this is very, very clear in Oppenheimer. Nolan essentially is being criticized for his depiction of scientists who work with the Manhattan Project. And a lot of people have argued that, this is a period of time where most of the scientists were white, and that's fair. But still, there were non-white men and women of many, many races who were part of this Manhattan Project and should not be reduced to footnotes. There is a very interesting article by Rayford in Essence, and I will quote. He says, thousands of African American women and men contributed to the Manhattan Project, but many of their stories remain untold. They were an important part of the workforce. Although African Americans were generally construction workers, laborers, janitors, or domestic workers, a limited number of African American men and women worked as scientists and technicians at smaller Manhattan Project sites in New York and Chicago. So here we have in this movie one black character, which we can find on IMDb is referenced as J. Ernest Wilkins, and he's got one little cameo in this entire film. There's no explanation. It's not clear who he was, what his association was to the Manhattan Project, and that is just very, very depictive of the way non-white people are treated in this film. Wilkins, in reality, was a child prodigy. He had already had his PhD earned by the time he was 21. He had been part of the University of Chicago's Met Lab, researching plutonium. He was working with other Black scientists, such as Jasper Jeffries and Carolyn Parker and Modi Daniel Taylor and Samuel Macy, all of whom were tremendously important. And I'm not naming them all of whose contributions were tremendously important to the development of the Manhattan Project. And this is a problem that we've seen specifically with Christopher Nolan in terms of how he chooses and envisions history. So, for example, in his previous movie, Dunkirk, he very, very clearly erases the presence of colonial armies in Dunkirk. So, for example, the Royal Indian Army Service Corps companies, who were not only on the beach, but they were actually tasked with transporting supplies over terrain that remained inaccessible to the British expeditionary forces. Okay, it ignores the fact, Dunkirk ignores the fact that by 1938, Lascars, that were people from mostly South Asia and East Africa, were one of 4 crewmen on every British merchant vessel, and therefore were huge participants in the evacuation. He also erases, for example, non-British individuals. So the French army at Dunkirk, for example, included soldiers from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and other colonies. And so, we have one crowd scene in Dunkirk where you see some white faces, again, unidentified. But that's it, There's also a complete erasure and ignoring of the fact that there was a racialized pecking order that determined life and death. And I'm quoting Rashmi Singh here, for not only British and French troops at Dunkirk, but also in every other theater of the Second World War. And this is important because, this is not factual accuracy and historical portrayal as these films actually claim to be. Because in the case of Dunkirk, for example, it's a very clear erasure of colonial troops who were crucial in averting absolute catastrophe for the Allies. And so when you have these enormous all-white productions, these choices of who is going to be in the cast, who is going to be in the frame, is not an accident. This is the result of 100 of small, large decisions in casting, in production, in directing, in editing. And therefore, what you are seeing is a very, very deliberate decision to keep a space, a white space. And that, I think, is tremendously important, especially when you start putting it into historical contexts such as Operation Legacy, which was, for instance, the end of the British Empire, was basically characterized by large-scale rearrangement of colonial records. The idea being to save Britain's honor, to protect collaborators, and these are things that actually feed into these long-term colonial decisions and harms and perpetuate them in our contemporary modern world by consistently propagating and perpetuating those historic harms towards these communities. So, these are decisions which Nolan has taken in choosing to whitewash the past. And in that, he walks in the footsteps of past film directors, and politicians, and our colonial emperors and colonial powers. The other point that I want to raise here, and I'm sorry, I'm sure I've gone well over 5 minutes. So Professora Daniela, I already offer my apologies here. The second issue here is the erasure of women. The film Oppenheimer completely fails what is called the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test is also sometimes called the Bechdel-Wallace test. And this is a measure of the representation of women in films and other kinds of fiction. This is a test that basically checks and it asks if the work that we are looking at features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. Okay? And the requirement sometimes also is that these two women be named. Some of the tests have this additional requirement. So you have two characters who are in this film, and they are both completely uninspiring and one-dimensional. And there's just a fantastic review by Victor Fraga in Dirty Movies that outlines how, Oppenheimer's love interest is, on the screen only a very, very few times, and inevitably she's naked. I'm sorry for any of the spoilers that I'm giving to you. And her only purpose of existence is to be a sounding board for Oppenheimer's consciousness. Okay, Oppenheimer's wife is a little bizarre. She's sad. She has very little to contribute or say, and she is absolutely and entirely desexualized, despite the fact that she's just had a baby. Okay, because obviously women cannot be multidimensional. They cannot be mothers and satisfactory sexual partners at the same time. They cannot be more than this one individual, one dimensional individual. And so that is a problem. And of course, this goes back to what I was saying previously in terms of whitewashing and erasure. There's a very clear erasure of women in this entire film. There are no women politicians. There are no women scientists. There's one woman who turns up who gets put on the plutonium team according to Oppenheimer's orders, and that's it. That she's never seen again. And this is not a reflection of what United States is at that time. We are at a period in time where an American woman has received a Nobel Prize for medicine. We have many African American women who have received a PhD. One is a staff supervisor at NASA. You have American physicists like Frances Spence and Ruth Tittelbaum and Meryl Menser, and so on and so forth. We've got computer programmers, first women computer programmers in the world at the same time. So this is a complete erasure of women, again, not historically depicting what is happening, and that is a choice. And that is the propagation of a particular narrative. It is whitewashing, it is erasure of women. The other issue that I want to talk to you about here is the fact that this is, one, historically misleading, and two, illustratively deceptive or illustratively misleading. And what do I mean by these two elements here? The first thing, we have this very so-called historical biography by Nolan, which does not acknowledge or barely acknowledges that the war in Europe has finished. Hitler is dead. And that is the point when the bombs are dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In other words, Japanese surrender is essentially inevitable in August 1945. Okay? These facts are not really discussed. They're very, very, quickly brushed over. And this is a film that is 3 hours long. So the entire moral argument for developing this atomic bomb, which is repeated several times in this film, is about, how the Americans should build the strongest bomb, the strongest explosive before the Germans and the Russians get there, which makes no sense given everything was finished. Okay? Eisenhower at one point actually argued, that in his biography, and I quote, that the bombings were not needed at all. He said, I quote, the Japanese were ready to surrender and that it was not necessary to hit them with that awful thing. I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon. And this should be something that we should have remembered somewhere in the film, and that's completely erased and omitted. And in other words, it kind of forgets to outline that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are nothing more than a display of geopolitical power by ascendant United States in the wake of the First World War. But at the same time, in doing this, what the film actually does is it erases, it ignores, and it trivializes the deaths in Japan. It deals with the deaths callously. There is a point in the film when Oppenheimer basically talks about his invention and says, "I bet the Japanese didn't like it." Okay, this is ridiculous. You would never talk about a central character that is supposed to be a hero that you're supposed to sympathize with. That is not the villain in a film that is going to say something like that, for instance, about the Jewish deaths in the Holocaust. Okay, again, a tragedy. But the way you deal with European Jews dying in the Holocaust is very, very different from "I bet the Japanese didn't like it." Okay, there is a disrespect there that is reflective of the way non-white individuals are addressed in cinema, full stop. It is also illustratively deceptive. So there are a total number of casualties mentioned in the film from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 220,000. However, this is never represented. This is what is called responsive mimicry, where you have sentiments of allegiance, compassion, solidarity that you're trying to elicit from viewers. But for having responsive mimicry be effective, at the most basic, you require visual or at least a sound representation. And Oppenheimer has nothing along those lines. There is a mention of a number, but you don't know what is this number. We never see the faces of these victims. We never see their voices. Think about Schindler's List as, and there are problems with Schindler's List, but think about Spielberg's Schindler's List and its addressal of the Holocaust. We hear the names of people, we see their photographs, we see their belongings. They are humanized. And in this process, what Nolan is doing in Oppenheimer is he's robbing victims of their identity, he's robbing victims of their humanity. We never see a Japanese person in the movie. The word Japanese is barely said in the movie. And at the end of it, what we are looking at, we are not even seeing an explosion. We are watching this firepower, this mushroom cloud, but there is not in one split second of a frame a depiction of the real horror of this atomic weapon. What you are seeing is an romanticized, beautiful explosion, which is completely blatantly neglecting the suffering of the Japanese. Okay, and what you as viewers are being asked to do is to sympathize with the tormented but virtuous protagonist and never with the real victims in this scenario. So this is a problem, because what this is essentially doing is sanitizing white mass murder, and what it is doing at its heart is white centering. What do we mean by white centering? White centering is essentially the prioritization of white feelings and interests over those of people of color, where white feelings and comfort is chosen over black and persons of color's humanity. So what you're looking at is, this consistent white centering of Oppenheimer at the expense of every other non-white person that inhabited the same space. Even at the end of the movie, when you had this zigzagging between Oppenheimer on trial and so on and so forth, he's not on trial for murdering 220,000 innocent people. He's on trial because it's his loyalty to the United States that's being judged. Look at the way you have essentially devalorized the mass murder of this enormous number of people to US and white and global North interests as to what is being loyal and what is important for their security. This is white centering, where every other suffering becomes a footnote and completely secondary to the feelings, the interests of the global North, the white person. And so I will conclude by saying one thing. The stories that we are going to share between ourselves give us our visions of individual identity, of collective identity. And when you are in these big productions, choosing the kinds of stories that you're telling, erasing the presence of those you see as others or less than equal, then these are stories and narratives that actually construct us versus them in the contemporary, the foreign and the other from the us. And the question that I then leave you with, what does this unrelenting white gaze, whitewashing, white centering, gender erasure do? It perpetuates centuries of historical colonial erasure. It minimizes harm to people of color. And in the process, it ignores, augments, and perpetuates a history of inflicting trauma and harm on the global south. And therefore, we can understand many, many, many things as they occur today. For example, the emergence of the right wing and the rise of extreme right wing movements, including terrorism, within this context. So I will leave you with that. Hopefully, you have something to think about. I'm sorry, I have nothing more positive to say about Oppenheimer, but yeah, I have some serious problems, and I speak to you as the other, a person of color, a person who comes from the global south, and quite proudly so, and a person who is no longer willing to accept whitewashing in 2023. Enjoy your film. Thank you very much. Bye bye.